Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and the War Within beta updates are actually arriving a little bit earlier to the War Within pre-patch as of the next week's Tuesday or Wednesday reset, depending on your region. So for today's video, I want to do something ambitious and compile all of these things in one single video. Every single one of the buffs and nerfs that are arriving in just a handful of days, because this project is quite long. Please utilize the chapter marks if you just want to skip directly to the classes you're interested in the most, or feel free to skip around and check out all of the different updates arriving this reset. As a side note, there is a lot of minutiae little micro adjustments happening to all tanks globally for the War Within expansion in prep for the Season 1 content. Most of them are not really significant. It's just little ways to soften up tanks a little bit going into the next expansion. But if you do want to get the detailed info for that, I have a link down in the description below where you can read up all the detailed tank changes specifically. Besides this though, I do want to thank you guys all so much for supporting this channel during this expansion development cycle. I cannot wait to make more content for the expansion once it fully comes out. If you want to see regular War Within updates, be sure to follow this channel and subscribe. Otherwise, enjoy this entire class video breakdown. Starting things off alphabetically, we're going to go over with Death Knights, and off the bat, the Blood Death Knight is the first spec we'll be talking about, which allows us to mention the tanks are receiving a global nerf as of this update. This was something that didn't really make it into the pre-patch so far, but was evident on the beta. But all the tanks essentially are going to go through minor little adjustments where they're not necessarily going to be that much weaker, but just a little bit weaker, where the healer is gonna want to be more involved in tank survivability. You shouldn't start having to heal the tank every single global of your lifetime, but the tank is going to rely on the healer a little bit more. This is going to affect Blood Death Knights, Veg Demon Hunters, and every other tanks, but it's going to affect them a little bit differently. So for tanks specifically, if you're looking to play a tank with this update, I would check out the blue post that I'll link down in the description, but I will mention some of the more important highlights for each tank specifically, but just know all tanks are receiving like a global nerf all across the board. For Blood Death Knights specifically, we're not receiving too many changes. We are receiving a sizable damage increase of about 10%, though for the tank and changes, we are seeing adjustments, primarily with the mechanic of how your death strikes are going to function. A new gameplay mechanic is being added called Coagulating Blood. Coagulating Blood is now going to scale and increase your death strike healing based on the amount of damage you've recently taken. So as you can see, Coagulated Blood, after taking a bit of damage to my health bar, this damage is adjusted every few seconds. So as you continuously take damage, this damage will end up scaling as you take additional damage worth of health. So as you can see, the stacks of this buff actually increase the amount of healing that your death strike is going to do depending on the damage that you take. The more damage you take, the more damage the death strike is going to be able to heal through, and that damage now scales. In a way, think of it like every time you take damage, it collects the damage into a bucket. And every time you press Death Strike, you get to kind of empty out the bucket. And the bucket, all that healing that it would have been increased for your Death Strike, all of it goes out of the window to be recollected all over again, starting from scratch. Essentially, this allows you to not be able to spam Death Strikes back to back to back, because the Death Strike healing is going to be less effective. So you'll want to press Death Strike, burn a couple of globals outside of Death Strike, then press Death Strike again in order to maintain your health bar, but you won't just be able to spam Death Strikes back to back to back, because this bucket of healing is going to continuously adjust and get emptied once you press your Death Strike. So that is something you're going to want to start tracking as a Blood Death Knight with a weak aura, or if you have yourself the personal resources bar down below, that number that it provides you with the Death Strike stacking, that is going to give you a percentage of how much more healing that Death Strike is going to do based on your maximum health. Gameplay wise, you're just going to want to use Death Strike every other global at most. You'll want to press Death Strike, use another ability, take some damage, then you can press Death Strike again. And this becomes a lot more important of a thing that you want to manage in Mythic Plus dungeons in particular, especially if you're doing some of the higher end dungeons as well. Besides, this part of a Blood Death Knight playstyle is going to come from the Bone Shield and how the armor adjustment is going to scale better with your strength, where the armor gain from Bone Shield charges is going to be increased to 100% of your strength, which makes it a little bit more functional. As a Death Knight, you are still going to have a very spiky damage profile, so you are still going to take unexpected amounts of damage rather quickly. So if you are going to be healing a Death Knight in particular, also this means that you are going to be having your heart drop down to the floor every time your Death Strike takes an auto attack worth of damage. Besides this though, we did see an adjustment with Bone Storm, which now consumes less Bone Shield charges while maintaining full effectiveness. This is primarily done in order to adjust it how it functions for your Insatiable Blade cooldown reduction, but also lessens the Shattering Bone playstyle a little bit as well, though Bone Storm is still a very popular choice even after all these changes currently on the beta. Besides this, we have specs such as Frost, which are actually receiving nerfs across the board. Frost damage, all ability damage is being reduced by 15%, as well as certain talents and abilities such as Glacial Advance reduced by 15%, the Icy Deaththorn passive proc reduced by 15%, the abilities such as Frost Strike and Obliterate see an 8% damage buff, while Sindragosa sees a 12% damage buff. Shattering Frost cleave effectiveness goes from a 65% effectiveness to a 60 effectiveness, so that is going to be a slight less cleave output, and the strength provided by Enduring Strength is reduced from 20% to 15%. Shattering Blade on top of it also sees a reduction from 125% with a value increase for your Frost Strike down to 115%. Which sounds like a lot of nerfs, but trust me when I say this, Frost Death Knights on the beta are still a very highly competitive playstyle, and it really does open up once you get access to the Deathbringer and the Ride of the Apocalypse hero talents in particular, but it is still a very strong spec even with all these changes week by week over on the beta. And the same thing can be said about Unholy Death Knight, also seeing quite a few nerfs here and there, all ability damage reduced by 10%. However, abilities such as your Cloning Shadows do receive a 25% damage buff, though from there on, we do see reductions outwards. With Bursting Swords now increasing the Festering Wound damage by 16% instead of 20%, and the Bursting Swords damage is being reduced flatline by 8%. Super Stream will apply the other two dots of Frost Fever and Blood Plague at 75% effectiveness instead of at 80% effectiveness, and the talent of Raise Abomination now costs a singular rune compared to no rune cost, so slight adjustments here and there, but nothing should really be holding Unholy back down too badly. And again, just like Frost over in the beta, Unholy, even after all these numerous nerfs, still continues to be a very competent and competitive melee spec so far over on the War Within. Then we have the class of Demon Hunter, starting off with the spec of Vengeance. Just like every other tank, Vengeance is receiving a number of tanking adjustments, and I definitely would recommend checking out the link in the description below in order to see specifically all of the minutiae of changes that are happening to Vengeance. But some of the more important stuff that I can cover here are going to be adjustments to certain talents such as Thicker Skin, which is seeing a little bit of a stamina reduction. Also, defensive passives such as Demonic Words will reduce your physical damage and magic damage by 8% instead of 10%, and abilities such as Soul Cleave are reduced in healing by 20%, though again, if you want to see the full list of changes, and it's really minutiae little adjustments here and there, definitely check out the blue post below. As for the spec of Havoc Demon Hunter, we didn't see too many changes. The biggest one is going to be all ability damage for this spec is being amplified by 13%, and one of your core abilities, I-Beam, has received a 100% boost in terms of its overall damage. And lastly, the chance for you to proc Fire Inside for your resets to gain another charge of Immolation Aura has been increased from 25% up to 30%. Then we have the class of Druid, starting off with a spec of Balance, where for Balance, we actually covered them kind of recently, but Bumpkins are receiving a roughly 6% spell buff all across the board. Your Treants are going to be receiving a 60% melee damage buff, though you're not really going to notice any kind of big adjustments for this one until you unlock Keeper of the Grove and pick up something like Power of Nature in order to amplify it further. Certain talents such as Mushrooms are receiving a 20% damage buff and generate slightly more astral power. Umbral Inspiration is being improved to increase the damage of some of your periodic effects to 35%. Denizens of the Dream has seen a slight reduction but will now scale better with boomy damage procs as well as your crit chance, so it should help make up the difference. Plus, talents such as Wrath and Starfire cast within Umbral Embrace will now get benefits of both the mastery versions of your Nature and Arcane of your Boomkin Mastery, which allows them to function a little bit better with abilities such as Convoke as well. For Feral Druids, we're seeing some drastic buffs across the board. Feral Druids are clawing their way back up little by little. We're receiving a 30% melee auto attack buff by 30%, which is quite a bit. Melee, not a huge portion of feral damage, but a significant amount in single target. Blades such as Rip amplified by 15%. Rake instant damage increased by 30%, but the bleed damage also further increased by 5%. Shred 30% buff there, Swipe 30% buff, Brutal Slash 30% buff as well as Lunar Inspiration instantaneous Moonfire damage increased by 30%, where a good portion of it is dot aspect, but at least the instant damage is a little bit more effective. Even abilities such as Thrash are increased by 30% for the instant damage and 5% more for the bleed damage as well. Primal Wrath immediate damage is also increased by 20%, and even Adaptive Swarm immediate damage is also increased by 20% also. Talents such as Rampant Ferocity, which is how Feral Druids cleave in War Within, is going to be increased by up to 100% whenever the Feral Druid spends additional energy on their first bites. So if you're trying to get bigger bites, you'll actually have Rampant Ferocity increasing in value as well. Talents like Tasteful Blood are getting adjusted where they're actually reducing their effectiveness. Versus Bite deals increased 12% damage instead of 15%, with the damage scale by 12% inside of Tiger's Fury instead of 50%. So both values going from 15 down to a 12. Apex Predator does get a slightly higher chance to proc more than usual, and that is kind of a noticeable, especially in big, large, open AoE situations. Berserk now gains a damage buff, which increases your ability damage and auto attack damage by 15%. Berserk Frenzy gains additional bleed value, increasing the damage of your abilities. The bleed effect has been amplified from 135% up to 150%, making it a much more noticeable of a gain when it comes to making Berserk a burst cooldown. And they even trying to give Druids a reason not to go into Convoke, specifically as they're trying to improve Incarnation Avatar of Ashman, which as of this update sees an increase to the energy cost reduction, increasing it to 25% reduction, but also Ashman's Guidance upgrade for the Avatar of Ashman Incarnation ability. Now this effect lasts for 40 seconds after your Incarnation window ends, which should hopefully give you a much better burst window. For Barrier Druids, they're pretty easy to summarize. For the most part, they're receiving this generic tank nerf across the board. Definitely check out the post down below because it's very detailed, lots of minutia. But also on top of it, Guardian Druid is receiving melee and ability damage buff by 20%, except for things such as Moonfire. They're really trying to make sure the Druids don't really go too crazy with the Lune Chosen, which has been the go-to hero spec. But yeah, so basically a lot of the arcane damage is not receiving nearly as much value, but a lot of your physical and bleed-based damage should be increased by quite a bit. Restoration Druids are seeing a number of changes where things such as a Life Bloom are receiving 5% more healing over time healing and 30% more bloom healing. Big cooldowns such as Tranquility amped up by 15%, basic heals such as Rejuve and Wild Growth increased by 15%, and even Sinner and Ward further increased by 20%. Then a lot of their lesser used talents have gotten buffed up, so they're going to have maybe potential value in the future, but as of right now, not the most popular picks. Things such as Embrace the Dream, buffed by 50%, Nourish buffed by 100%, although it's really difficult to compete with the Grove Guardians, still they are trying to improve this ability quite a bit. Then you also have Convoke, which is a very RNG ability that keeps the Druid feeling kind of like a slot machine. They've added 4 extra spells for rested Druids in particular as part of your Convoke duration. So the duration doesn't change, you just add 4 extra spells into the ability in order to hopefully fish out more healing spells inside of this cooldown. Still very much a slot machine RNG kind of gameplay. As a Druid, also Power of the Archdruid receiving a slightly higher chance for your Wild Growth to trigger its effect. Again, a bit of a slot machine, but hey, slightly improved chances there as well. Also, Resto is receiving quite a big hybrid nerf across the board. Abilities such as Rake, your Rip, Bite, Thrash, all of your cat abilities for the most part, even Shred, are receiving a 15% damage reduction, but also so is Sunfire, which is going to be noticeable if you're trying to play around the hybrid damage build as a Resto Druid. Also, certain cooldowns such as Trio of Life increase your healing by 10% instead of 15, so that's a nerf there, but also increases the healing of Rejuvenation by 40%. Previously, that value was 50%, so also a bit of a reduction there as well. When it comes to the class of the Evoker, we're seeing more of a generalized set of changes. Things such as Disintegrate, Fire Breath, Azure Strike, Deep Breath are all increased by 10% for all 3 specs of this class. Certain healing abilities such as Verdant Embrace amplified by 20% for healing, as well as Living Flame amplified by 30% for all 3 specs as well. Heading forth into Augmentation, we are seeing some nerfs, although it's very unlikely the players are going to stop bringing in Augmentation Evokers in raids and dungeons. They're still a very effective spec, but they're trying to make them a little bit less good with that whole party playstyle and layout. Buff talents such as Black Attunement from your Draconic Attunement now has been reduced to 2% baseline maximum health increase for your party. instead of 4. The Aspect's Favor now amplifies the effectiveness of the Black Attunement by 1% instead of 2% per talent point invested, so further reducing the impact of Black Attunement as a party buff. Ebon Might ability now has been adjusted, where instead of granting your allies 6.5% primary stat or scaling off your primary stat, that scaling has been reduced from 6.5% down to 5%. So less primary stats to provide to the rest of your party. Also, there was a passive for Evokers which was called Closest Clutch Mates, which has been removed. Previously, Closest Clutch Mates would allow augmentation to be 10% more effective on both of your Ebon Might ability, but also on your Breath of Eons outside of raid content. So essentially, you're receiving a 10% damage or a party-wide buff nerf inside of 5-man content and smaller group sizes than a full-on raid. For Speculative Devastation, we're not seeing too many crazy changes, but definitely a set amount of adjustments that give you a bit more room in terms of creating a few new builds. So basic abilities such as Eternity Surge are increased by 26.5%, while Pyre is increased by 10%. The base damage of Shattering Star, not its debuff component, is increased by 10%. And even abilities and talents such as Firestorm are increased by 10% as well. Animosity, which is the effect that allows you to scale up and extend the duration of your Dragon Rage, has also been adjusted, where each of your empowerment abilities extends it by 5 additional seconds with a maximum cap of 20 seconds, which has been increased compared to a previous version. Talents such as Satanic Wrath now only cost 1 talent point, which leaves you with an extra talent point to invest anywhere you want to. But also, Imminent Destruction talent has been swapped places with Feed the Flames, where Imminent Destruction can be easier picked up for a burstier combo, which actually makes the playstyle of Firestorm a little bit more feasible, and you may actually see Evokers running around with Firestorm potentially a bit more often, either in pre-patch or after you get access to some of your hero spec talents later on. Next, we have the Spectral Preservation, which is even some healing adjustments more than anything, with abilities such as Spirit Bloom, increasing your healing by 20%, which is a nice bit of single target healing, but also quite a bit of AoE healing also if you want to use it that way. Reversion as an ability now has a bit of a pandemic effect, so you can actually apply this ability right as it's about to fall off as a healing over time. You don't have to wait for it to completely tick out on a target before you refresh it, so refreshing it actually allows you to secure some of its leftover timed out value into the next rotation of a reversion, which is also kind of nice. The ability of Life Bloom also, or Life Bind specifically, has a bit more of a unique aspect to it. The ability by itself allows you to kind of help share a heal amongst everybody affected by Life Bind, but this passive now is also going to function off of healing procs, whatever that means, but essentially it should allow Life Bind to maintain a little bit more overall effectiveness as a healing ability. From there on, we have the class of Hunter, where we're receiving Beast Mastery Hunter getting quite a bit of a nerf all across the board. So if you've seen Beast Mastery Hunters running around over in pre-patch doing some ridiculous damage, yeah, that looks like that's going to be taking a bit of a backseat now. You have a variety of adjustments from your basic pet. Melee damage reduced by 10%, talents such as Laceration reduced down to 8% value instead of a 50% bleed value. The ability of Kill Command receives a 20% nerf on top of it, as well as the Haunt Master's Call. Both Haughty and Fenrir's attack damage is reduced by 33%. Dire Beasts, and this means all Dire Beasts that you summon, their damage is reduced by 10%. The basic pet abilities such as Smack and Stomp are also reduced by 10%. And finally, Barb Shot receives a 25% damage reduction, which is kind of unfortunate for any of you Beastmaster Hunters who would just level in a class trying to have some fun with pre-patch. But yeah, I don't think Beastmastery is going to be going anywhere whatsoever, but that is a noticeable change that you're going to notice in your overall damage output. For the spec of Marksmanship Hunter, we're not seeing a lot of changes. For the most part, all they've done this update is to resolve some of the wind arrow functionality with certain abilities such as Rapid Fire. But from what I've been able to research so far, it seems like a very minor adjustment, not necessarily major. So Marksmanship for the most part is going to stay relatively the same. However, what isn't staying relatively the same is Survival, which has seen some adjustments when it comes to cooldowns and damage profile a little bit. So Survival has been very popular when it comes to its grenade playstyle and how it synergizes off of your explosive shot with multiple different talents, so they're trying to rein it in a little bit. So things such as Grenade Juggler have been adjusted, where casting explosive shot now reduces the cooldown of Wildfire Bomb instead of having an explosive shot go off and hitting multiple targets, so that has been a hard cap to 2-second reduction. Things such as Grenade Juggler and Sulfur Line pockets no longer proc the cooldown reduction effect for grenades, so there's going to be a little bit less cooldown reduction wireless baked into Wildfire Bomb. The Wildfire Bomb damage has actually been nerfed twice, by 5% and 25% separately, so this AoE damage is a little bit less good. However, they did make it 80% more effective against your primary target, which reduces its cleave value, but does give it more of that focus damage funnel, which is not the worst. The ability of Flank and Strike has gone through a wild array of changes, some buffs, some nerfs, but for the most part what they try to do is adjust it where the Flank and Strike is actually a two-part attack. It's you and your pet attacking at once, so that damage was not being scaled properly when it comes to the actual Flank and Strike ability, and Flank and Strike pets were not benefiting from things such as Hunter's attack power scaling or Hunter's mastery scaling. So essentially, now that all of those things are functional, Flank and Strike should do a little bit more damage after all of these adjustments, and should also now start consuming your tip of the spear procs as well, as the ability is supposed to cause focus instead of generating your focus. Certain single target abilities such as Raptor Strike as well as Among Us Bite have been buffed by 5%, while your Explosive Shot ability for survival only has been reduced by 5% for its AoE value. From there on, we have the class of mages, where starting with your Arcane Mage, we're actually seeing a mastery adjustment, where your mastery bonuses for Barrage and Blast are being improved, so those abilities both scale much better with mastery. This could make certain talents, such as Prodigious Savant, a little bit more impactful and might open up the whole bottom right section of the talent tree a little bit more for Arcane Mages going forward. Besides this, a barrage of different changes have taken place, like Fire Blast, or Arcane Blast rather, being improved by 4%, Missiles further improved by 11%, Barrage baseline damage has been reduced by 60%, but it now scales much better with your Arcane charges. So it essentially is a buff for the most part, but like using natty barrages back to back is going to net you a little bit less damage. Let's say if you're trying to use it in PvP or in places like lots of movement. Arcane Familiar Summon actually now deals 50% more damage, which is kind of exciting, though Arcane Orb as an ability does receive about a 10% damage reduction. Arcane Echo Splash Effect from Touch of the Magi is being adjusted where you're seeing a little bit more damage but less volatility or less procs for it. They have like a cooldown to the amount of times that it can pulsate. This is primarily an adjustment for the game performance, so players get more FPS whenever this ability goes off against multiple targets, because it has so many different instances of damage. When it hits multiple enemies, it can actually tank your performance. So it's been adjusted so it essentially isn't really a loss or a gain in damage, but rather a gain in FPS, if anything. Talents like High Voltage are being pulled back on a bit. They're reducing, or rather, yeah, they're reducing the base proc chance of this ability down to a 10%, but now the talent gains 10% more likelihood increase per failure to generate an arcane charge, so the base floor is a little lower, but each time you fail to gain an arcane charge from your missiles, that increases rapidly by 10% each time. Finally, talents such as Aether Attunement, cleave damage has been adjusted. The priority damage is still going to be 100, but that cleave damage to secondary targets is reduced down to 50%, which again makes the bottom left section of the talent tree a little bit less effective, which makes me wonder if bottom right section and Late Drinker could potentially now have some thriving potential. Then we have the spec of Fire Mages. We're just seeing a nice set of adjustments, quite a few buffs, but then quite a crucial nerf as well. Baseline ability damage like Pyroblast improved by 5%, Phoenix Flames improved by 10%, Fireball improved by 20%, and Scorch improved by 25%. Improved Scorch playstyle allows you to debuff the enemy, make it take 7% more fire damage from you, stack it up to 2 times, so that's been an improvement there as well. The ability of Flame Strike, they're really trying to incorporate it, so that playstyle is getting buffed, or the ability itself buffed by 10%. The Quick Flame playstyle for the Flame Strike is now increased to 25% additional damage, while Flame Patch is receiving a 30% damage buff. So they're really trying to incorporate Flame Strike quite a bit. All of this because Living Bomb damage is being reduced by 63%. This is a very noticeable change, and Living Bomb is okay in big AoE situations, but on the beta, it is no longer a fantastic cleave talent anymore like it used to be. It's still kind of sort of effective at times, but yeah, the power of Living Flame or Living Bomb has been reduced drastically. Also, Living Bomb can now spread to a maximum number of 8 targets. It can't spread to any more targets than 8, as well as all the other talents that interact with Living Bomb, such as Lit Fuse, Explosive Ingenuity, and Explosivo proc chances have also been drastically reduced by quite a bit. So if you're playing Fire Mage and you're seeing that your Living Bomb is not doing as much damage as it used to before, you might want to start maybe potentially building into a Flame Strike or playing into a heavier Ignite type of gameplay. From there on, we move on to the Frost Mages, which are receiving buffs all across the board. Based on abilities such as Ice Lance receiving a 10% damage buff, Glacial Spike also a 10% damage buff there, Flurry a 12% damage buff, and then the AoE ability of Blizzard a 50% buff on top of that. Together with Frozen Orb by 10%, your AoE damage is going out of control. Comet Storm further increased by 10%. And even talents such as Ray of Frost are improved by 20%. The Splintering Ray now allows your Ray of Frost to deal 30% of his damage to nearby targets. Hard to tell if this will be enough to make it playable in AoE content, but then certain talents such as Splitting Ice are actually increasing the cleave damage of your lances by up to 90%, which is really cool. Cone of Cold is receiving a 100% damage increase, which is kind of okay. It's not a really often used ability unless it's in AoE content. So in AoE resets for burst damage, it does gain a little bit more value in that regard. Also, talents such as Death Chill are getting nerfed a bit, though it's not the worst nerf ever. The Death Chill stacks are now increased from 12 stacks to 15 stacks, but now each stack only increases your damage by 1% instead of 2%, which makes Death Chill less of a mandatory option to run in raids as well as in AoE content. So if you do want to have a more single target build that doesn't prioritize Frostbolt damage, you now can utilize other talents, so I guess there's some good benefits in that regard specifically. From there on, we have the class of monks, starting with the Brewmaster, and just like every other tank in the game, Brewmasters are receiving various adjustments because they are a tank, and tanks are globally receiving a bit of a nerf. However, Brewmasters did get a couple of adjustments that actually make them a little bit better in a sea of tank nerfs. Brewmaster has actually gotten tankier than before, which is quite surprising. First of all ability damage for Brewmaster has been amplified by 15%, which is quite significant. But also, Brewmaster's Balance now further increases your armor by 45% instead of 25%. So you are going to notice the Brewmaster in particular is a lot more survivable and a lot more passively tankier. So out of all the tanks that have gained nerfs this time around, Brewmaster has gained crazy buffs where your survivability, at least passive survivability, is very similar to like a Bear Druid or to like a Prot Warrior to a degree. It's a lot better, and this spec feels really good with this amount of changes. Stagger has also been improved by 5%, which further makes the class even better when it comes to dealing with damage taken. But also, Stagger itself has been buffed up further to be 58% as effective against magic damage, which is still as an increase from where it was before. Therefore, it means that Brewmaster passively takes less physical damage and less magic damage, even though there are some other self-healing components that are being nerfed, though I would ask you to reference those in a blue post that will link in the description of this video, just because it's lots of little minutiae changes and talents that are just like, it's a lot to go through in a single sittings. But if you are planning to play a Brewmaster going forward, I would definitely reference that link down below. From there on, we can move on into the Mistweaver, which is receiving healing buffs across the board with some adjustments here and there. Abilities such as Vivify are receiving a 56% healing increase, which is quite huge. Both Revival and Restoral are receiving a 15% healing buff as well as your Gust of Mist Mastery is receiving a 10% healing increase. Though certain defensive or utility party talents such as Life Cocoon are actually receiving a 40% absorption reduction, though even by testing on the beta, it is still a very highly effective defensive external, so it'll still be really good overall. Melee healing is actually seeing an improvement, with Ancient Teachings transferring melee damage by 170%, which is an increase from, I believe it was 130% or somewhere along that ballpark. Essentially, melee healing is getting even more improved as of this build. With the talent of Jade Bond, that actually adjusted how it functions for both Chi-Ji as well as Yulon. For Chi-Ji, it actually has a bit of better cooldown reduction whenever you activate Gust of Mist Mastery, and Chi-Ji's Mist healing is increased by 60%, while Yulon's Soothing Breath is increased by 500%. Initial value was 300. Finally, the talent of Yulon's Whisper's healing has also been further increased by 30%. Then we have the spec of Windwalker Monk, which is receiving a wide variety of changes, and these are kind of gonna make your head spin a little bit. Essentially, all of your basic abilities: Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, Rising Sun Kick, Fist of Fury, Thunder Fist, Dual Threat, Strike of the Windlord, all of them reduced by 8%, so it's interesting, while certain AoE abilities such as your Russian Jade Wind buffed by 20%, Spinning Crane Kick buffed by 13%, Chi Wave has been buffed by 80%, and then you have a lot of your other talents that have actually been buffed up by quite a bit. So it's like it's a baseline nerf, but those talents help bring up the damage by a decent bit as we get through them. Certain talents like Touch of the Tiger increase the damage of a Tiger Palm by 40%, while Hardened Souls increases your crit strike chance of Blackout Kick by 10%, which is an increase. With the talent of Communion of the Wind, the Strike of the Windlord damage is being amplified from 80% to 100%, which is a considerable gain. With the Memory of the Monastery, which increases your Tiger Palm's chance to proc Blackout Kick procs by 25%. Zuen's Bond, a previously kind of underwhelming talent, has been amped up, which increases your Zuen's damage by 30% whenever Zuen is out and about. With the talent of Crane Vortex, it actually increases the damage of your Spinning Crane Kick by 30% from a 20% increase. With the talent of Meridian Strikes, you actually get better cooldown reduction for your Touch of Death whenever you proc combo strikes, which makes the talent even more effective and allows for more aggressive Touch of Death setups. With the talent of Martial Mixture, you actually see a bit of a reduction of Tiger Palm damage increase, reduced to 8% per stack, but now those stacks can now stack up to 30 times, which can net quite a bit of additional Tiger Palm damage. With the talent of Rising Star, you actually increase the damage of a Rising Sun Kick by 15%. And finally, a Quality of Life adjustment. Whirling Dragon Punch now has a bit of a grace period where it can still be used even as Rising Sun Kick and Fist of Fury are coming back off of cooldown, which is a very noticeable rotational change where sometimes you feel like you can press Whirling Dragon Punch, but that the game doesn't allow you just because the other two abilities are very close to coming off of cooldown. So that is actually a nice quality of life improvement. From there on, we move on to the classes like Paladin, where the Holy Paladin actually receiving a bit of nerfs when it comes to their healing, but their damage side of things is getting a little bit more interesting. So, abilities, basic healing abilities such as your Holy Light, reduced by 28%. Ouch, because the ability was actually getting quite a bit of value. Holy Light becoming a more popular ability, but it's gotten nerfed. Holy Shock healing also reduced by 18%. Word of Glory, Light of Dawn, and Flash of Light reduced by 5%. Though certain offensive abilities such as your Crusader Strike are actually improved by 75%, Shield of Righteous by 25%, Hammer of Wrath damage also improved actually by 50%, but it has a slightly longer cooldown of 15 seconds. While some abilities are getting buffed up, abilities like Judgment are actually receiving a slight 10% damage reduction, Consecration also a 10% damage reduction, and the ability of Holy Prism has seen a 10% damage and healing reduction. Same thing goes for Barrier of Faith. The initial healing effect, the initial absorb, is reduced by 10% also. The passive effect of Merciful Auras also saw a 10% reduction, and it just continues on from there. With procs such as Touch of the Light further reduced by 10% as well, with Judgment of Light healing also reduced by 10%. The cooldown reduction talent of Imbued Infusions has had its cooldown reduction for Hollow Shark reduced from 2 seconds down to 1 second. The Sanctified Wrath does help reduce the cooldown of Hollow Shark by 50% whenever wings are active. Overflowing Light now converts 30% of Holy Shock healing into a shield instead of 50% of its healing. With the talent of Moment of Compassion, the Flash of Light heals for an additional 50% when cast on a target affected by a Beacon of Light, which is an improvement from 15%. Saved by the Light now procs whenever a target drops below 50% health instead of 30% health, to make sure that if they do get hit by a big one-shot, at least at the 50% health threshold, it is more likely to consistently proc than at below 30. The talent Power of the Silver Hand increases the healing of your next Holy Shock by 20% of all damage and effective healing done, up from 10%. And finally, the talent of Holy Infusion has also been removed from the talent tree. Moving on to Protection Paladin, just like Guardian Druids, Vengeance Demon Hunters, and Blood Death Knights, all tanks are getting some generic nerfs, so I would definitely reference the link that I'll have in the description of this video for all the little minutiae changes, but it's a lot of little small adjustments that are just bringing down the effectiveness of Protection a little. However, like all the other tank specs, Protection also sees all ability damage improved by 15%, so at the very least they have a bit more of a bite, even though they're going to be a little bit more squishy. As for Retribution Paladin, we got a handful of adjustments, like a brand new talent called Holy Flames. With Holy Flames, Divine Storm deals 10% increased damage, and when it hits an enemy afflicted by expurgation, it spreads that effect to 4 nearby targets, and it deals 3% increased holy damage to all targets burning from Expurg. This is now in the same row as Blade of Vengeance. So Blade of Vengeance does this spread of Expurg and AoE cleave from Blade of Justice, or you can spread it more naturally while increasing your holy damage while improving Divine Storm immediate damage. Besides this, Retribution also saw a bit of a healing buff for Word of Glory, improved by 44%, which might make it better in situations like PvP combat. But also, Retribution Paladin, most of their basic combat abilities have largely been nerfed by 10%. Essentially, any ability you can think of, even things such as your Crusading Strike or Tempo Strikes, literally every ability saw a 10% reduction. Except for Divine Storm, which saw a 25% damage buff instead, so I guess better cleave, but less single target output overall on the Paladin. Lastly, with the talent of Blessed Champions, it is now down to just 1 talent point cost instead of 2, so I guess you get a refund on a talent point, but it causes Crusader Strike and Judgment to hit an additional 4 targets for 25% reduced damage instead of for 50% reduced damage, so a little bit of adjustment when it comes to the cleave capabilities. With the class of Priest, we're seeing a couple of generic adjustments, such as healing increases for all 3 specs of Healers of Priests, from your Flash of Light, Power Word Shield, and Power Word Life healing increase for all 3 specs by 20%. Things such as Cauterizing Shadows also saw a 60% healing increase, which is a little bit of healing that scales a little bit better, at least over on the beta. But also the talent of From Darkness Comes Light, the stacks for this effect now are increased by 3% per stack instead of 1%, and the stacks you can have is up to a maximum of 20 times stacks, so overall better healing and more upfront value from Darkness Comes Light, especially good for specs like Shadow Priest who need some immediate healing on a moment's notice. From there on, we have Disc Priest changes where their healing, the overall healing output, is no longer reduced by 3%, but also all damage has been increased by 5%. This helps out Atonement greatly. But also we've seen some significant healing increases, not damage atonement healing, but rather proper healing, with things such as Holy Nova healing improved by 23%, Power Word Shields or Power Word Shields Absorb effect increased by 30%, Power Word Radiance healing increased by 10%, and now it has a baseline 18-second cooldown. This means talents such as Bright Pupil are less effective, reduced from 5 to 3 seconds. So if you pick it up together with Bright Pupil, it goes back to that proper 15-second cooldown, but if you choose to play Enduring Luminance, you get a little bit of cooldown reduction, which is better for Disc Priest timings. Penance healing specifically increased by 20%, not the damage for Atonement, but actual direct healing increased. Also, Rapture now lasts 30 seconds and begins its duration or cooldown as soon as you use the ability. You don't have to send all of the shields from Rapture before it starts getting the cooldown reduction. Also, the debuff lasts for, or the buff of Rapture lasts for 30 seconds. So if you want to delay it until a better moment, this can give you a bit more strategic uses for this absorbs in case you ever need it. They also apparently fixed the Atonement mechanic, which apparently was not healing properly in 5-man content. It was healing at a 50% increased rating, where it should have been healing at a 70% increased rating. So Disc Priests are actually getting a little bit more overall healing when it comes to 5-man content. When it comes to the spec of Holy, we're mostly seeing corrections for this spec, mostly numerical tunings and changes like a damage increase of 10%, your basic heals such as your healing increased by 44%. I know it sounds a little bit confusing, like healing, but the healing of your heal ability increased by 44%. Flash heal improved by further 20% on top of it. Prayer of healing also improved by 30%. Holy Word Serenity further improved by 20%, as well as Divine Image healing, specifically the Healing Light spell, increased by 20%. Circle Healing also saw another 30% buff on top of it, but if you play with Healing Chorus, the effectiveness of Healing Chorus has been reduced. Instead of 5% per stack, it is now 3%, but Circular Healing now has more of an upfront value without having to fully stack it up with Healing Chorus, so that is nice in that regard specifically. Also, the talent of Lightweaver increase for healing, again getting confusing here, but Lightweaver healing amplification is now increased by 25%, which should make it hopefully a little bit better for pure single target compared to, let's say, things such as Lightwell. For the spec of Shadow, we're not seeing as much of an overcorrection, but there are some nice, actual, tangible rotational changes to some of these tunings. Overall, 3% damage increase for Shadow Priest, but also Dark Ascension as a cooldown is being toned back a bit. Instead of increasing your non-periodic shadow damage by 25%, it is down to 20%, which makes it a little bit less good, but I think for the most part it's an adjustment, mostly for Void Weaver and Archon, where one prefers Dark Ascension heavily, while the other prefers Void Eruption more heavily. Mind Flay, by the way, Mind Flay both Insanity, Mind Flay Insanity and Mind Spike Insanity both have been buffed up. Base Mind Flay damage increased by 50%. Mind Flay Insanity will not channel over 1.5 seconds, which is much burstier. Also, Mind Flay Insanity can stack up to 4 charges, which allows you to bank up all those charges and then consume them very, very rapidly. Similar things happening to Mind Spike as well. Base Mind Spike damage is increased by 50%. Mind Spike Insanity damage is further buffed up by 15% on top of the Insanity buff that it applies naturally on its own. Also, if you're playing into the Spike playstyle with Mind Melt now stacks up to 3 times, but each stack provides 30% crit strike chance instead of 4 stacks for 20%, so it just becomes a lot more effective of a talent that allows you to benefit from the Mind Blast crits with Mind Spike more actively, more readily, and make a talent such as Mastermind crit damage value even more impotent. Speaking about Mind Blast, that's also got buffed up by 30% on top of it. And finally, Idol Cthulhu, all those tentacles have been adjusted. They do 50% more damage in a shorter duration, so they get their damage out much quicker. But also, they fixed a lot of issues where the tentacles would spawn but wouldn't attack, or sometimes tentacles wouldn't spawn, or tentacles would spawn and just do nothing, or tentacles would try to attack but don't get to attack. So all of those Mind Flay tentacles or Idol Cthulhu tentacles should be fixed up as of this build. Next, we have the class of Rogue, where we're actually seeing some crowd control adjustments primarily for PvP. Things such as Gouge are actually getting a 25-second cooldown instead of a 20-second cooldown. And then we have crowd control abilities such as Kidney Shot increased to a 30-second cooldown, which kind of makes it a little bit less good in terms of PvP content. They are actually making the stun duration better outside of PvP situations for rogues in particular, where Kidney Shot can actually stun targets for 8 seconds, but that value does not get adjusted for PvP whatsoever, so just a flat nerf for PvP in general. As for the rogues themselves, Assassination is seeing a huge amount of changes across the board. All ability damage buffed up by 14%. Auto attacks improved by 20%, which is a significant gain in single target. Abilities such as Envenom are buffed up by 10%, while Crimson Tempest buffed by 19%. Venomous Wounds also provides you additional energy from 7 energy per tick to 8. Doesn't necessarily change the spec too much, but it may make haste as a stat gain a little bit more of a cap value to it, as in you'll just be getting more energy, which is going to be a noticeable change. But for the most part, Assassination was not really struggling with energy previously, neither on the pre-patch or on the beta. When it comes to the spec of Outlaw, this is probably where we're seeing the most amount of actual tangible changes. A lot of it is tuning, however, with ability damage for the spec amped up by 21%, auto attack damage improved by 20%, individual skills such as your Sinister Strike or Pistol Shot improved by 10%. Even the Blade Flurry initial damage has been increased by 50%. Just the initial damage, not the actual Blade Flurry cleave value, but the initial hit you do, it's a gain either way. Even abilities like Killing Spree saw an 8% damage buff all across the board, which is quite tangible. Also, you have some RNG changes towards certain talents that play around with Roll the Bones, like Sleight of Hand now has a 15% chance to grant you additional buffs from Roll the Bones. A nice buff, but not really one that's impactful. What is impactful, however, is adjustment to count the odds, which also has a 15% chance to grant you Roll the Bones buff that you don't already have for 8 seconds from ambushes, Sinister Strikes, or Dispatch. This one is very noticeable. With rogues losing our tier set that we had in Dragonflight heading into this expansion and not getting that tier set back as a talent or any of that sort, this is actually kind of a huge change that allows you to get more buffs as a rogue and allows the Keep It Rolling Sinister Strike non-ambush builds to shine a bit more, because you're able to generate more comm points more regularly to extend them with Keep It Rolling, making that non-ambush playstyle a little bit more feasible. You also have an adjustment with combat potency. That's been increased a little bit in terms of the energy regen. Not crazy amount, since Outlaw rogues didn't really struggle with energy regen previously, but it is a nice change in terms of your overall energy. And then you have Ace Up Your Sleeve. Now, Ace Up Your Sleeve now grants you 5 common points back whenever it does get a reset, instead of 4 common points. This is a very minor adjustment, but it helps us out with cooldown reduction. Adding that extra common point that we get to churn into our finishers immediately allows Restless Base to help reduce all our basic abilities a little quicker. Overall, it means your cooldowns are coming back a little faster, and it gives us back a playstyle that feels like it's a little bit quicker. Overall, these changes have been really good. Still would like to see more for the class of rogue in general for both Assass and Outlaw, particularly with some of the different talents, mostly concerning hero spec stuff, but at least for pre-patch, this is going to be a noticeable gain. Even the spec of Subtlety has also seen additional buffs, with their auto attack damage being improved by 10%, eviscerate damage improved by 10, black powder improved by 10, although the ability of the finisher of Secret Technique did get a 6% nerf, which is going to be slightly noticeable. But once you get into the hero specs and you start picking up Trickster and you pick up the Unseen Blade, for the most part, you're not really going to notice too much of a difference over as the Subtlety Rogue. From there on, we have the class of Shaman, where we actually got a couple of generic adjustments. First of all, Healing Surge for all 3 specs of Shaman is actually getting amplified by 20%, so a little bit better self-healing and hybrid healing for enhancement and elemental. Also, Stone Bulwark Totem has gone through quite a change. It is now going to be a 3-minute cooldown that provides you with a substantially bigger initial shield and quite a bit additional shielding over time as well, which is fairly strong all on its own. So it's going to be a much better cooldown, especially defensively, and makes it a lot more powerful as an overall survivability amplification effect. For Elemental in particular, I guess the easiest way we could really break down their changes is Fire very good, Lightning not good at all. So Fire receiving nerfs while Lightning getting buffs. So there's definitely a bit of a thematic dominance right now for Shamans, where they're very lava heavy. So lava is taking a bit of a backseat through a variety of different nerfs, but Lightning is getting a lot better all throughout. So for the lava changes, we have Lava Burst damage reduced by 25%, Elemental Blast damage reduced further by 25%, Earthquake damage also sees a 6% reduction, Flame Shock receives a 15% damage reduction. Liquid Magma Total does get a 30-second cooldown, which is awesome to see, but the damage has been reduced by 30%. Not awesome. And off of the Primordial Bolt ability, Splintering Elements provides you 10% haste, which is a lot less than what you had previously. However, the gains are substantial, with the gains being Lightning Bolt damage improved by 3%. I know, crazy, amazing, but it's a decent start at the very least. Thunderous Strike Ward damage improved by 150%. Earthshock damage improved by 25% to make it a little bit more comparable to Elemental Blast for its Maelstrom cost and its overall gameplay value. Earthen Rage damage improved by 60%, Ice Fury damage improved by 85%, even Chain Lightning as well as Lava Beam damage improved by 10%. Power of the Maelstrom now gives you a 60% chance to cause the next Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning to guarantee an overload, with overloads being a little bit harder to come by now. That one becomes a lot more powerful of a talent. Chain Lightning of your Greater Lightning Elemental has also been improved by 200%. Call Lightning damage increased by 350%, and the Storm Elemental's Tempest ability damage has been improved by 400%. Also, the Lightning Blast that activates from the Fury of the Storm Talents, that ability has been improved by 200%. Testing these changes on a beta, they're actually quite significant, and I think Lightning builds for Shamans may actually be a lot better. Besides this, they also fixed a lot of issues with certain talents not interacting with one another or with certain abilities, so likely overall Shaman has received a buff, even though they are lowering the impact of lava and fire builds while raising the impact of lightning builds. Overall, I think the class is seeing a bit of an improvement as of this build. For the spec of Enhancement Shaman, we're seeing a slight buffs here and there, like Elemental Blast receiving a 25% damage increase. Primordial Wave now has a 30-second cooldown, which lines up with abilities a little better. The ability itself does a little bit less damage, but now properly scales with Shaman Mastery, as well as certain other talents, so for the most part, it just has better top-end scaling potential. Talents such as Doom Winds now have a 1 minute cooldown instead of a 90-second cooldown, so that makes it a lot better of an ability and also lines up a bit better with some of your other overall spells. Splintered Elements as a talent, like for Elemental, also gets only a 10% haste value, and also some very slight adjustments, things such as Molten Assault and Crash Lightning range has been increased by 4 yards, which makes it a little bit better to use within melee combat to make sure that you're reaching all those targets evenly instead of having to use it right on top of the targets you're trying to attack. Moving on to Restoration, we're seeing some varied tuning, like all healing of this spec is reduced by 5%, although let me be clear here, there's a lot of Rested Shamans out and about on the beta, and I highly doubt they're going to be less of them for some reason because of this change. From there on, we have talents such as Torrent, which increases the initial heal of your Riptide by 20%. It has a 10% increased critical strike chance, which is a bit of an improvement. Actually, on top of it, Riptide also got a initial heal further increased by 20% on top of it. Certain talents such as Unleash Life, as well as Healing Wave, buffed by 20%, and Reactive Warding ability, the healing effect of it has been further increased by 75%. The duplication of Ascendance healing has been reduced from 80% down to 70%, though it should still be fairly effective as an ability. And also, Ancestral Guidance has been adjusted where 10% of your healing and 25% of your damage is converted to a heal. Used to be 25 and 25, but the healing value reduced to 10, while the damage value still retains at a 25 full. Also, Earth Living Weapon has been adjusted where the healing itself, the healing over time effect of it, has been reduced to a duration of 6 seconds, but the healing has been amplified by 75% to make it a little bit more instant. With the talent of Ancestral Awakening, the healing right now has been increased based on talent points 25 and 50% if you fully invest into it, which initially was 15 and 30 at a fully invested value. Though we also did see a slight reduction with the talent of Spouting Spirits, which has had its healing reduced by 35%, though it should still be a very potent ability when it comes to increasing the defensive and group value of the Spirit Link Totem. From there on, we have the class of Warlock, starting with the spec of Affliction, which is getting some significant buffs all across the board. Starting with Unstable Affliction, your single target dot, increased by 45% damage, which is a significant gain in single target. The Dark Glitter increased by 55%. Soul Rot increased by, reading it correctly, 60%. Had to take a second, but 60% additional damage. Hell, even certain simple dots such as Agony improved by 40%. While your primary spender of your soul shards, Malefic Rapture, baseline damage has been improved by 20%. So Affliction Warlocks are rising up big time, and in fact the class of Warlock is actually improving quite a bit as of this specific update. With the spec of Demonology Warlock, we're seeing a couple of different adjustments, such as your Wild Imps now deal 15% more damage, Demon Bolt deals 55% more damage, and Demonic Cores have now a 50% chance, I think up from 35% chance, to be granted when a Demonic Core, or to grant you a Demonic Core when one of your Dreadstalkers fades away. So more consistent value gains for your Demonic Cores in general. Plus, they've also fixed a myriad of other little issues with the way certain talents were not interacting with your demons, or demon abilities, or demon-based talents. So overall, slight improvements for demonology all across the board in that regard to make sure that all the talents are properly functional with one another. Then we have the spec of Destra, where we're getting more damage, but trading off at a little bit less overall resource generation. So things such as your Chaos Bolt buffed by 40%, Shadowburn further improved by 125%, Conflagrate hitting 25% harder, Incinerates hitting 10% harder, Soulfire hitting 5% harder, Channel Demon Fire 10% buff there, and Channel Demon Fire does 25% more damage to all nearby targets, so it has a bit of better cleave potential. Hell, even your Infernal got a 10% buff on top of it. Rain of Fire saw a 35% damage buff, but we did see some reductions, such as Pyrogenics reduced from a 5% debuff to a 3% debuff whenever you channel Rain of Fire or maintain the Rain of Fire under a target. Ritual of Ruin now takes 20 Soul Shards baseline in order to proc the effect. When you do pick up Ritual of Ruin or go down into Avatar of Destruction, the Overfiend you summon will now generate one Soul Shard fragment every 1 second, instead of every half a second. Same thing as also applies to your Infernal, generating a fragment every 1 second instead of half a second, which slows down your overall soul shard generation on this spec specifically. And finally, we have the class of Warrior, starting off with a very baseline damage increase for all 3 specs, although only one of them is really going to get any value. Technically, all Warriors have access to Shield Slam, but only Protection really gets value out of it. Shield Slam hits 8% harder. Don't really know if any warriors are gonna, like Arms and Fury warriors are gonna get much value, but if you do end up experimenting with some shield type of Arms Fury gameplay, I guess there's some value to it now to a degree. Then when it comes to actual specs, the Arms Warrior does see a bit of a reduction. Mortal Strike reduced by 15% in damage, Overpower reduced by 20%. And you're probably expecting for me to say, but there's actually a gain. No, just a reduction for Arms Warriors, kind of out of left field. I was not aware that Arms Warriors were doing ridiculous damage or anything, but yeah, just a sizable decrease for Arms in particular. Though, like all the other tanks, Protection Warriors are also receiving that generalized generic set of changes that are affecting them because they are a tanking class. Again, refer to the link in the description of this video that will have the entire blue post specifically for all of the different tank adjustments that we've seen so far on the beta. It's a lot of little micro adjustments here and there, but Protection, I think, is one of the other tanks, one of the few tanks that actually get away with it almost scot-free. Melee attacks and ability damage for Prot Warriors has been improved by 30%, which makes this class hit like an absolute freight train, which is super exciting. On top of it, abilities such as Revenge do 25% more damage. Your Execute does 50% more damage just because you are a tank. Shield Charge now does 25% more priority damage to the primary target. So it has some cleave ability to it, but the primary target is going to take a hefty bit of damage. Imagine if that number crits, that would be amazing. And Ravager also has been improved by 25% on top of it. So Prot is getting away with a lot of damage buffs, but yeah, survivability is getting reduced slightly across the board. Though compared to some of the tanks that we've been able to test out over in the beta, Protection is really not feeling super all that different in terms of the tank mitigation. They've always relied on healers. They're just going to need them just a little bit more. So nothing really new for Protection in general here. If you're one way or another watching to the end of this video, I do want to appreciate you for watching the entire thing or parts of it, whatever you ended up watching. I do want to thank you all so much for watching. If you guys did like this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. It lets my channel get out there into the algorithm on YouTube, helps me out tremendously. Join our Discord. Link to the Discord channel is found in the description of every single one of the videos. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.